Welcome to another episode of 10 Arguments Against Moral Objectivity. In this episode, we're going to actually consider an argument from tolerance against moral objectivity. Tolerance is an important characteristic and hallmark of a good society. That is, we should tolerate a diversity of opinions, we should tolerate a diversity of religious or non-religious inclinations. There's a lot of good reasons for tolerance in a democratic society. And this argument against moral objectivity claims that if some moral code is the correct moral code, then won't that promote intolerance? That's what we're thinking about in this episode. Welcome to the Philosophical Life. Now let's take a look at the argument from tolerance. Premise 1. Tolerance is valuable only if the moral views of different people are equally plausible. Premise 2. If ethical objectivism is true, then the moral views of different people are not equally plausible. After all, it's just a side note, there is a correct moral code that is superior to other moral codes. 3. Conclusion. Therefore, if ethical objectivism is true, then tolerance is not valuable. Now let's take a look at each of the premises and see how plausible they are. Well, premise 2 is true. That is, if you're an ethical objectivist, you don't think that the moral views of all people are equally plausible. You actually think that some moral views are better than others. So premise 2 is fine, and the ethical objectivist is going to be on board with that one. But now what about premise 1? According to premise 1, tolerance is only valuable if the moral views of different people are all equally plausible. But the first premise is not true. In fact, there's a good case to be made that moral objectivism better supports tolerance. Why? Well, if the first premise is true, and tolerance is most valuable given that all views are equally plausible, then this has the implication that a tolerant view is equally plausible as an intolerant view. And if that's the case, then the view of the bigot or racist is no better than your view or my view regarding what's moral and immoral. In fact, Russ Shafer-Landau takes this a step further in his book, The Fundamentals of Ethics, that we're following. You can actually construct a counter-argument that shows that this way of going counts against the anti-objectivist. Here's how that counter-argument would go. Premise 1, if all moral views are equally plausible, then moral views that support tolerance and those that support repression and intolerance are equally plausible. Premise 2, moral views that support repression and intolerance are not as plausible as those that support tolerance. Conclusion 3, therefore, not all moral views are equally plausible. Now, what about this counterargument? Well, the first premise looks true. That is, if all views are equally plausible, then all views, whether they're tolerant or intolerant, are equally plausible. Now, premise 2 will be something that the person who supports tolerance will likely embrace. According to that premise, moral views that support repression and intolerance are not as equally plausible as those that support tolerance. Now, if it's up to individuals to determine what's moral and immoral, such that there are no objective moral truths, all truth is just relative or purely subjective, then an intolerant view is no better than a tolerant view. Why? It's just a matter of personal perspective or cultural perspective, and no one is really making a mistake by holding an intolerant view. Now, if social codes ultimately determine what's moral and immoral, then a social code that's highly intolerant is no better than a social code that is not intolerant. So the rejection of tolerance by a society that embraces highly intolerant social codes is equally as plausible as your embrace of tolerance. Now, those that think that tolerance is super valuable will want to embrace objectivism. That's the easiest way to make sense of tolerance and claim that a tolerant moral view is superior to an intolerant moral view. In fact, you might say that tolerance is a value that's morally required even in a society where it's rejected. In fact, that's where it's needed most. This line of thinking is totally compatible with moral objectivism, and it does this by supporting premise 2 in the counter-argument against the original argument. Moral views that support repression and intolerance are not as equally as plausible as moral views that support tolerance. So this way of arguing from tolerance against moral objectivity ultimately fails. Keep thinking ethically and living wisely. Keep living the philosophical life.